Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer Matt D. Wilson. Matt, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we met at Heroes Con in Charlotte, and you were talking about, among many things, King Oblivion, Ph.D. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the character and the series of books that you've written.
Certainly. So King Oblivion, Ph.D. is a supervillain that I created who maybe shares some similarities but is quite legally distinct from Marvel Comics' Doctor Doom. And a series of books that I have written pertain to him. The first two are his how-to guides for how to be a supervillain. They're called the Supervillain Handbook and the Supervillain Field Manual. They are part of his egotistical need to impart his knowledge onto the world, even though he doesn't really think anyone is up to his level or could accomplish as much as him. And then the third book, which is the most recent one, it came out in 2017, is called Supreme Villainy. That is his autobiography, which was actually never finished. He was never satisfied with anything that his ghostwriters provided him. So I'm actually a character in the book. I, as the editor, compiled all the different pieces that he had writers write over the years and then put it together in sort of an unfinished autobiography. So all of his notes to the ghostwriters are in the margins throughout the book. And it's got letters to him, to publishers that are threatening letters, asking them to publish the book. There's a letter from his attorney saying you can't possibly publish this because you're admitting to hundreds of crimes and that sort of thing. So it's more than just a straightforward novel, but it's probably more novelistic than the first two.
And the character of King Oblivion, you said that it's legally distinctive from Doctor Doom, but there is something about
Yeah.
those grandiose villains in comic books, the ones that are like a Lex Luthor or Doctor Doom. They always seem supremely confident, and yet at the same time they always fail. And I'm just wondering what it is about that failure and that confidence that drew you to create this character.
I feel like that is a huge part of why I wanted to write as that type of character. King Oblivion kind of came about accidentally. I spent a lot of my earlier writing years trying to get into the world of comedy writing. And I did some freelance comedy writing in my early 20s. And through a sequence of various events, I started a website with a friend called the International Society of Supervillains, which I thought was just a funny name. We also both happened to be working for a newspaper at the time. And one way that we decided we could maybe avoid some trouble would be to write under pseudonyms. So I just chose, kind of out of the blue, a pseudonym, King Oblivion, Ph.D. And as I continued to write under that name, I developed more and more of a voice for this character, to the point where I felt like I knew him and understood him in a way that, he's not exactly Doctor Doom. He's got his own ego and his own, essentially, and you kind of spoke to this, he's in a perpetual state of denial where he, even in failure, even when he loses, he believes he has won, and he can spin everything into a victory or come up with an excuse as to why it didn't work that didn't have anything to do with him, or convince himself that the next plan is going to be the one that really pays off, the one that really catapults him to, world domination or whatever it is he's trying to do at that particular time. So having that kind of unreliable narrator who themselves is in denial, who's consistently trying to convince themselves of a reality that's not the reality, is fascinating to me and makes them a great character not only to write about but to write as, because you've got to juggle all those different goals at the same time. And so I feel like the trilogy is the trilogy. I think King Oblivion's story is finished, but writing those three books was, I could even surprise myself with what would come up as far as how deep into denial he could be.
And it's interesting because you talk about this character and how you developed him. And I remember years ago in an issue of Marvel Age, there was a page of quotes from Doctor Doom, and they were all that sort of grandiose talk, and they were great to read them. So getting the book published, what sort of path did you follow? Was this something that you did crowdfunding for, or were you able to, get to a traditional publisher and go that route?
I initially self-published the first book, which under a different title. It was called Hate You Forever. And I just published that essentially print on demand. It was sort of pre-Kickstarter. So I didn't even consider that as an option. But I had written it over the course of, 5 or 6 months and shopped it out to literary agents and different publishing companies, and wasn't getting a lot of response. And so I kind of just determined, I'll publish this myself. So I went to, I don't even really remember the name of the website, but it was one of those print-on-demand websites where if somebody orders the book, it is then printed and then shipped to them, and then the print-on-demand company takes the largest cut of the cost, or of the the sale price, and I get maybe $1 for my trouble. But it was a way to get it out there, and so I decided to do that. And then maybe 2 years later, I met an author named Scott Kennemore, who had some books published by a publisher called Skyhorse. About his theme was zombie related. He had written a series of books about zombies, and kind of like zombie self-help was the gimmick of those, and they're very funny, and that eventually translated into novels for him too. But he had written this whole series, and I had mentioned that I had written this supervillain series, and he said, that's really funny, I think my publisher would like that, let me give you my editor's contact information. And that snowballed into me contacting Skyhorse, them reading the book, deciding that they wanted to publish it, and then the 3 books came about from that. So just a self-publishing first, and then a lucky meeting. I happened to have the book, print versions of the book that I could show to them, and it went from there.
And speaking of going from there, it's a good segue. Now, you said you were working in journalism. You started doing some writing of superhero fiction, or supervillain fiction, I suppose. How does that lead you to doing some work in comics?
I've always wanted to write comics. I've been writing comic scripts since I was in my late teens. Partially because in, I want to say, 2002 or 2003, Marvel brought back Epic Comics. And as part of that return of Epic, which in the 70s was just a big format magazine imprint, this version of Epic was supposed to be people submit scripts, submit ideas, submit pitches for Marvel Comics books, and if they really like them, they'll publish them. That didn't really pan out, but I and every other writer I know my age had an epic pitch that they submitted, and I did much the same. And because of that, I gave myself a bit of a crash course in scripting, describing panels, figuring out how to describe layouts to an artist with words, and that got me really going on trying to write comics, come up with comic concepts, and have these various pitches on hand. And I've had those pitches still for years and years. None of those pitches have seen the light of day from back then. But over the course of a decade, I finally was able to, get some of that comics work out there. In the meantime, I've been writing prose and done other types of writing work in the meantime. I've just kind of been juggling all of that at once. I've never been focused on any one particular part of it. But the comics part has always been there. It just took me a very long time to really to take those things from words into art, and have artists who could finish that work for me, because I have no artistic talent. Only words for me.
So you've got a book out now called Everything Will Be Okay, and I know you had done another series before that. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the books that you've been working on, and how that sort of collaboration with the artist works out for you.
Absolutely. So the first book I did, the first published comics work that I did, was a book, and it's still ongoing. It just comes out sporadically. A book called Copernicus Jones Robot Detective, which is a mashup of like classic noir and sci-fi, but specifically the type of sci-fi that you might recognize from mid-century. So kind of old-fashioned, rivety robots. I tend to describe it to people, if I'm at a comic convention and they ask about it, because I have those trade paperbacks with me at conventions. I'll say, if you've ever seen like an old cartoon or an old film strip about what people in the 40s and 50s thought the world of tomorrow was going to look like, this is that world, but a few decades later. So everything's a little bit run down and a little bit shoddy. And the robots who did all the menial work have kind of come into their own as members of society. And so the lead character of that book formerly was a police robot and is now a private eye. That one was published by Monkey Brain Comics when that was a going concern. Now it's self-published by me, still on Comixology. And it's been published on Comixology since, I want to say, 2013 or so. It was originally a webcomic even before that. And I did a Kickstarter for the print version of that series. So I have a print version of the first 6 issues. The new series, which I just finally have the print collection finished of, is called Everything Will Be Okay. And the premise of that book is sort of a high concept, what if every possible disaster happened at the same time? So it's my way of working through my anxiety about not just personal disaster, but global disaster. And so I thought if I took a kitchen sink approach to it, where every bad possible thing could happen, I could sort of lift that weight off of my brain. And I don't know how well it worked, but I think this resulting story is really interesting. And it's kind of about an utterly absurd situation, but the characters in the book, who are a brother and sister named Anya and Edgar, who are both engineers, they react to everything as you would expect someone in this type of a crisis to react. So I try to be as real as I can with the characters, while being sort of absurdly cruel to them at the same time. And I think the result is a really interesting 5-issue miniseries.
And is the tone of this serious, or is this something where we can kind of smile along because we can see the absurdity of it?
I think you can take it either way. I feel like that is kind of up to the reader. I think it's possible to read it entirely as satire. And I also think it's possible to read it as, a dramatic story for these characters. I think it depends on whether you're kind of stepping back, looking at the high concept and seeing the absurdity of the concept, or if you're reading it from the position of, I want to relate to these characters. And that's a balance I wanted to try to find. And I hope we found it. The initial ending I had for the book was more bleak, more cynical. And as I got to the point of scripting that, I decided I could not allow myself to do that. I couldn't bring myself to have that kind of ending. So it's more of a dramatic, hopeful ending than I originally envisioned. And so I think eventually, as a writer, I came around to the side of sympathizing with the characters more than the satire side of things. So I really think it can kind of go either way. And I'm glad that it strikes that balance. And
I was going to ask about the characters because, it seems that, you're thinking about the characters and what sort of journey they're going on. And I was wondering how you balance, the crazy events with what they need to learn about themselves to satisfy their personal journey.
a big part of that is that the two lead characters, Anya and Edgar, are brother and sister. And so ultimately it becomes a story about family. Even though there are these huge things happening on the macro level, and one of the, you might call it the gimmicks of the book, is that each issue, and again it's a 5-issue series, each issue focuses on a different kind of disaster. So there's the disasters that occur on Earth, which include both real possible natural disasters like earthquakes and tornadoes and flooding and that sort of thing. But also, there are Godzillas and King Kongs. There are huge monsters. There are vampires. There's everything. It's absolutely a kitchen sink approach. But it goes from that to space disaster because they escape Earth on a space station. There's alternate universe disaster, and then there are other kinds of disasters beyond that. So it, on the macro level, it is as huge as it can possibly be. But when we do focus in on the characters, it's about a brother and a sister who have been through a lot of hard things together, and you can still see that they love each other and care about each other in the way that they interact with one another, but also they've been traumatized. One of the first things they talk about is how, their mother horribly died. And so, on the big scale, it's totally absurd. On the small scale, it's a family story about these two characters with very different personalities. Edgar is a little more cheerful. Anya is a little more cynical. Who still love each other and are attached to each other despite every possible thing going wrong.
And as a writer, as you're sitting down and coming up with the high concept and the characters, as you sit down and start to write the script and have to think about the visuals, have you spoken with the artist prior to that, or is it something where you're just going to write and then hope that you're able to find the right partner to work with you on this project?
I think when you're starting doing comics, or you're doing comics in a more independent way like I do, you probably do come to an artist with a project more fully formed than if, you're working at a large publisher and all you have is a pitch to go from. Then you might craft that story more toward an artist. In my case, I had scripted large parts of this series before I ever found the artist. In this case, the artist for that book is named Rodrigo Vargas. He lives in Chile, and he is amazing. I am waiting for someone to walk by a copy of that book, say, "Who drew that?" and make him a superstar, because I feel like his art is incredible. But I, came to him with scripts already done, essentially. I think I had written 3 issues of the series when we kind of teamed up on it. But as part of that, it's, those things aren't carved in stone. So if he is reading through the script and he says, "I'm not sure this is the way I want to draw this," or "I have a different idea," or "this particular element of this doesn't make sense to me," we'll have a conversation about that. And more often than not, I will end up saying, "Oh, that's really smart. That's a great way to visually represent this concept. Do it that way." Or we can talk about why I initially wanted to have it that way in the script, and maybe, come to some kind of compromise. So even though, in this particular case, it came to the artist already scripted, more fully formed than maybe it would have in other circumstances, it can always be adapted and changed, because, I'm not somebody who's going to think of an artist as somebody who just needs to draw my vision and not say anything else. I want them to contribute and collaborate, and I'm going to trust their instincts as a visual storyteller to help me get what I'm trying to say across. And they often they're right about that kind of thing.
Well, it's great to hear that, there's that collaboration, because you hear sometimes about the writer and the artist never speak, and they just, perform the script as written, and sometimes the story just doesn't work out so well. So it's nice to hear that there's that collaboration, because I think in many ways it makes the writer and the artist both better.
I would agree. And I think that is a result of not being on the time crunch deadlines that you get at, companies that have to put out monthly books, and where an editor has, 8 books that they have to just make sure are coming out on time. And so they'll throw a writer and artist together, and maybe they'll meld as far as their sensibilities, and maybe they'll clash, or maybe, it'll just be kind of a, I did my part, you do your part kind of thing, because there's a grind to it. And not to de-glamorize the world of big publisher comics, but that's often how that goes. And in this case, even though it makes the process take a little longer, maybe a book doesn't come out every month, maybe it comes out every 2 months, because everybody working on this has a day job in addition to making a comic, doing their passion of making comics, but they've got other obligations and time constraints. But that also gives us more time to talk things out and really come to a consensus about what works and how we want to tell this story. And the colorist, Joe Hunter was the colorist on the book. The colorist can come to me and say, are these colors working? Are these what you had in mind? And we can talk about that. And more often than not, in that case, I said, yes, absolutely, it looks great. But sometimes I would say, well, let's tweak this, and here's why. And I think as long as you give a reasonable explanation as to why, instead of saying just do it the way I want, you can have an understanding of each other and work together better as you learn what each collaborator is kind of looking to get from the process of creating this thing together.
You spoke of passion and how, because this isn't that day job for everyone, that you're able to sort of indulge and work a little bit harder and take a little bit more time. Comics seem to be a passion for you because you are also part of a weekly podcast, War Rocket Ajax, if I got that correct. So what can you tell us about the podcast?
That is a podcast that, shockingly, I have been part of for going on 9 years. With Chris Sims, who I believe has previously been a guest on this show. Mm-hmm. Chris and I talked about earlier about being from the world of comedy writing to a degree, or writing humor articles. Chris and I both worked for the very brief magazine relaunch of Cracked Magazine, circa 2005-ish. And at that time, Chris had a very popular blog that was largely about comics, but was also very funny. And I was, freelancing, writing for various comedy websites, National Lampoon. I got a couple of items on McSweeney's, and the list goes on a bit after that. But we kind of got to know each other by both writing for Cracked, and I think that version of Cracked only lasted 3 or 4 issues, but then it continued as Cracked.com, the Cracked.com that exists now. But we both worked for that. We realized we both had a deep, abiding, long-lived interest in comic books, and became friends from that. And Chris went on to work at Comics Alliance. I continued to have my comedy website. I wrote my books. I worked for newspapers. But we knew each other for a while after that. Chris actually started that podcast, War Rocket Ajax, with another co-host named Eugene Ahn, back in, had to be 2008, 2009, maybe? Yeah, 2009, I believe is right. And they did the podcast for approximately 40 episodes. But sometime around then, Eugene started a rap career where he would rap about stuff in comics and didn't have time to do the podcast anymore. And so they started talking about having a new co-host, and I just kind of approached Chris, who I had known for a long time. I had been on the podcast in those 40 episodes before that, just kind of as a pal who jumped on to talk about, old weird comic stuff like swimsuit issues and stuff like that. And I said, I can do it. I can be the new co-host. And from there, I have since done approximately 380 additional episodes since then. Really more than that, because we don't count a special monthly episode we do called Every Story Ever, where Chris and I rank every comic story ever written, ever published, on a list from best to worst. Currently, I think there are about 800 stories on that list. And it is the most popular thing we do. We will never be able to stop doing it. But that's an additional thing we do monthly, which is not part of the numbered episodes. So probably all in all, it's well over. I've been a part of well over 400 episodes of that show.
So Matt, they're telling me that we're just about out of time. If someone wanted to find out more about War Rocket Ajax or King Oblivion or Everything Will Be Okay, how can they find out more?
mattdwilson.net, which is kind of my homepage. It's got links to all of that. Copernicus Jones Robot Detective, Everything Will Be Okay, all my King Oblivion books, and War Rocket Ajax and the other podcasts I do. If you want to find War Rocket Ajax directly, that's at warrocketajax.com. All the King Oblivion books are available on Amazon. And as far as Everything Will Be Okay is concerned, right now it's only available in print to Kickstarter backers. I may make the print edition available in other ways in the near future, but I want to get that to Kickstarter backers first. Digitally, however, all 5 issues are on Comixology.com.
Well, Matt, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon.